Okay, let's get going. Hello, wine world. Welcome to Silicon Valley Bank's 2021 Videocast presentation of the 20th annual State of the Wine Industry Report. I'm Rob McMillan, and I'll lead today's discussion. I'd like to welcome our viewers. This is something that I like to. I'm always amazed at how many people from all over the world show up, since this is a report really for the wine industry here. But we have a lot of people that tune in from all over the world. And we have attendees today from Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, Lebanon, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Georgia, Romania, Singapore, South Africa, Sweden, the UK, Uruguay, and the US, and a partridge in a pear tree. It's a lot of people tuning in from all over the world because they're interested in the US wine business. And that's a good thing, for sure. Just as a note, this is a two-part presentation. So part one is presented today, but we'll have a follow-up presentation next week where we'll continue the discussion and respond to questions. Tomorrow we'll be sending out email registration information for part two, along with the links for a replay of today's presentation. And also links to charts from the annual wine conditions survey, most of which won't be used today. There'll be some of them that we will use, but definitely look at those charts when you get them. Along those lines, we appreciate everybody's effort in helping with that survey. I know surveys are really kind of a pain. We're over-surveyed as an industry, but I beg you guys to please do the surveys when they come. We only do 2 a year, and it's critical for these reports for understanding the industry. We give it away free, but it's a partnership. If we can't get enough responses, we can't do this work. So when those come out, please do something and pass it around, promote it, etc. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time in the Q&A panel. We'll send a link to the recordings after the webinar, as I mentioned. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel of experts today. That includes Amy Hoops, who's the president of Wente Family Estates. Erik McLaughlin, CEO of Metis, it's an M&A firm in the Pacific Northwest. Devin Joshua is the managing director, and he's head of direct sales at Merryvale Vineyards. And last, Paul Mabray, who is CEO of Pix. They just used to be Emetry. They just changed their name a couple of weeks ago, but you all know him as I call him Dr. Digital. So with that, why don't we dig into the report? And I think, Heidi, if you can, let's just start with this slide. So this slide is, I think, a good place to begin, because what it shows is what's happened in this last year. So this is a long-term slide. It's a Nielsen slide, off-premise sales. And this is one that I started to talk about in 2017, and you can see what happened to case sales. They started kind of dropping through the floor, and I raised the alarm that there's an issue here, and we've talked about it. And some of those issues, the two major ones, still exist. Which is converting the young consumers, the rotation of older consumers, and neo-prohibitionist impact on wine sales. But if you look at this chart, obviously when the shelter-in-place orders went through, that's not what happened to overall sales. This was great to use before the shelter-in-place orders, because as long as channels didn't shift, all of us analysts could actually use this kind of as a proxy and a check for how the industry would actually perform. And this last year, all of the analysts are kind of stuck trying to figure out exactly what happened. Obviously, this isn't what happened to the industry, but there was a lot of press coverage about using this as a proxy, and you can't. That's just part of the story. So let's go to the next slide, Heidi, if we can. There we go. So this is 2020 off-premise, so by month, and so the last was the long-term view. This is the short-term view, and you can see on the left side of the chart, those bars are volume, and the colored section is value. And so when you look at this, what you notice is the beginning of the year when we were oversupplied and acute oversupply. When we were selling through grocery, there was discounting that was going on because we had a lot of wine to sell and a lot of wine to move. And you can see that the growth rates weren't really that good. Remembering last year, we were somewhere around flat growth is where we ended the year. So that's a continuation of that pattern. And then the shelter in place orders came through. And then you can see over time what happened with reopening, and notice those bars, how they drop down below the top of that area. That shows you what happened in the grocery sales is that the discounting stopped. It flipped on its head. So it's not an economic thing. It's actually just a channel thing. It's access to the consumer. The consumer, by the way, in this shelter in place period, this is the joke for a parlor game now. It's, what does toilet paper and wine have in common in 2020? And the answer is it was panic buying. It says that wine is actually recession proof and maybe somewhat pandemic resistant as well, because people do want their wine, and this was part of that. But by the way, nobody should mistake that meant that people were drinking all of that wine. They were storing it up, just like they were storing up toilet paper. They didn't start using more toilet paper. It was to store it up so they had it. Next slide, please. So now here's on premise. This is the other side of that, right? To the extent we saw that gigantic growth, that spike in the off premise sales. We also had in 2020 the opposite. We had the closing of restaurants and the closings of tasting rooms, and I'm sure everybody was just as shocked as me when that happened. By the way, I thought pandemics were only kind of something you'd see in a sci-fi movie, sci-fi movie for that matter. So if to the extent that I'm predictive of anything, I look at that and go, well, I didn't see that coming. Well, there's a lot of things I didn't see coming actually this last year. But look at the on-premise for alcohol as a whole. This doesn't reflect demand. This just reflects the reality of closures. And you can see this is again a Nielsen CGA slide, and this is a 4-week slide versus 52-week, and you can see that we got down, pretty much to total closure, and it started to come back. And this only goes up to September, but it's gone back down again with additional closures. We have had a pretty bad December from everything that I can see. The end of November and the first part of December was actually not so good. So with that's an entry point anyways to the discussion. That gives you some context. I can go back and I can talk about the fires. I can talk about all the things that we all went through together emotionally, but I really want to be predictive and talk a little bit about where we're headed as well, because I think we know where we were, and I think it's also fair to say that what we have experienced is temporary, and we can't build business models on temporary. If you were on the right side of the equation in this channel shifting, you're feeling pretty good. If you're on the wrong side, you're feeling pretty bad. But I've been amazed at the kind of resilience that this industry has demonstrated, and the shifts that have been made to try to find those consumers and recover. With that as a starting point, Paul, I think you wanted to talk about maybe slide 9. Is that a good start?
Yeah, I think that wow, what a year we've been through entirely. I mean, if you combine a pandemic, fires in most wine regions, very polarizing election, just political environment, and then all kinds of reckonings. It's been quite a challenging year. I think that the one thing that we can say is the genie's out of the bottle. as it relates to e-commerce. If you can see our online growth from 2% to 10%, it's just the beginning. We're catching up with ourselves entirely. We had a lot of digital debt, meaning we had infrastructure, people, and processes that we've started investing to capitalize. And the only way we could sell to customers, and that train has left the station. And the people that are investing in that are going to keep doing more business online. And I think we're entering the golden age of wine online, to be really honest with you. I don't know if Amy and Devin agree, but it feels like it's the start of something great that's been kind of pent up for a long time.
Just beginning, yeah. And
yeah.
Devin, I think you wanted to talk actually about the next slide 10.
Yeah, well, I'll kind
make
of
some observations.
Jump on Paul's coattails talking about the golden age of wine e-commerce. And one of the things that I think it's really important to keep top of mind, which I know we all do, are the margin aspects of that. I think it's really interesting. I think this slide really points out dramatically how efficient you have to be when you're shifting your sales to e-commerce. The two channels that were really hurt the most in DTC, the tasting room and wine club to a lesser degree, you can see that the average order value is actually up in those channels, even though the revenue and volume growth is down. And of course, we saw the huge increase in e-commerce, but of course, on shrinking margins and lower average order value at a minimum. So given that so many new online wine consumers have showed up in the last few months, people who haven't actually done this before, I think it makes it even more important for all of us to make sure we communicate how it works. So we make sure we're shipping efficiently and trying to keep those margins as tight as possible. So I think this does present a big opportunity, but it definitely puts us in the position to have to raise our game in regards to efficiencies and logistics and how we get things done in regards to e-commerce.
Yeah, let's go back to that slide, slide 9, Heidi. Yeah, because I think that's one to linger on, Paul. I think you had some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I want to back to Devin. I think that one of the things that we haven't had a lot of subject matter expertise around is not every single dollar that comes digital goes into our pocketbooks. We have customer acquisition costs, we have customer retention costs, we have shipping, an operational overhead that we need to account for that's not fully baked into the model yet. And we're still all kind of learning together. And you've been very outspoken about the cost of e-commerce versus tasting room for a very long time. And I think that really kind of leans into Devin's point there. Retention has been the new acquisition for 2020. I think that we can agree with that. And I think it's a good, healthy exercise for us. If you look at some of the continued sales that we maintained during the pandemic, is extracting value from customers that we had in our database and learning how to keep them happy and sell more wine to people we already had. So wine club stayed stable. A lot of the tasting room stability you see is actually from telemarketing sales. I think it's a little underrepresented in this chart because we don't account for that channel appropriately. We put all of our phone sales into the tasting room bucket. But yeah, it's really interesting that what looks like sustainability was because we did a better job selling to people that we already had. This should be a trend that we continue going into 2021 and beyond, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I will talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, about the switch in e-commerce. But this one of the things that people will probably remember, I've been saying for a very long time that the tasting room model was kind of broken. We were seeing decline in tasting room visitation, and there were several reasons around that. But the whole notion that we had to have people come to the tasting room in order to sell to them, in order to get them onto the wine club list, in order to sell to them on the wine club, it's a choke point that just doesn't make a lot of sense. As I've said, we don't, if we're going to buy a car, nobody expects us to go to Detroit to buy it. That's not, the cash register doesn't have to be, especially in a digital world, right? And this really underscored that problem in a way that I hadn't anticipated, or anybody had anticipated, obviously. But it is one of the issues that we face. For us to go forward as an industry, direct sales are, the rest of the world is in retail is coming on saying, yeah, this is this is the way, whether it's subscription models or whatever. And we're just going to have to get better at it. We did a great job, I think, as an industry in coming at this this last year. But it's, there's more growth, I think, required. Amy, you come at this, I think, from a pretty unique position, because Wente actually has many different sides. You have grape growing, you have a restaurant, you have online, you have e-com. So you probably have some points of view for this last year and what you guys experienced.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. I think it's important to recognize, as you said, the acceleration of some of the trends that we've been talking about for the last couple of years. The fact that we knew digital needed to be something to be invested in, because that's where the consumer that hadn't quite yet taken over as the lead, our Gen Xers followed by our millennials, are really living in that landscape, and that wine's been behind there. And I think actually, if we pull up slide 26, and we take a look here, this is just a long-term e-commerce trends in wine. And you can see the great impact that the shelter in place and this pandemic has had, a huge growth. But now flip to slide 27. And what you'll recognize is that the penetration that we've had since the pandemic in place, we've seen 10 years growth in a 3-month period with the pandemic. And this to me is just that opportunity to say, hey, when you get a bunch of lemons, you got to make lemonade. And what we're seeing from some of the data, and we had discussed earlier, Rob, or yesterday, I guess, was that about 60% of these online wine buyers are potentially new to buying wine online. Now, what that means is everybody was sheltered in place. They were forced to do it. We know the behavior is already very much accustomed in so many other parts of their life. And wine is a natural piece of it. And when you were stuck at home and you still wanted your beverage, you went online and purchased it. Now the onus is back on the wineries. Because what we're seeing in the data, I guess, is that the consumer is ready. Their behavior is already innate. They're accustomed to it across so many categories. Are we ready? Are we ready to do what it takes in order to engage appropriately? And Paul, I see you shaking your head no. And I would agree. I think very few are ready. You can even go to the next slide, 28. And you can see here, even in the answers from those that have responded to this survey are saying almost half of them still don't have a data analytics person that's reviewing consumer data. The consumers have shifted, their behaviors have changed. We've seen a massive acceleration of what we knew was to come. And this can and should be the golden age of digital for wine, as both Devin and Paul have said, but it won't be if we can't get our houses in order and appropriately engage with those consumers.
And let's be clear, Amy, I think that you're exactly right. And kudos to you and Wente. I mean, you guys did a great job with digital out of the gate and really leaned in. You had an infrastructure ready and supporting that you'd been investing for a couple of years before it just happened to hit with the pandemic. But it's hard. Don't make any mistakes about it. Digital transformation is really, really hard. I worked pro bono with 4 wineries and it was a struggle. It's that we're paying down debt. We don't know a lot of these we don't have processes or people or systems. And this is a great example of that. A data analytics person will pay dividends in better targeting and return on ROI, the ROI of their efforts.
And Paul, we've had this conversation as I've been putting this report together. And, we're talking about, what are I got this question from somebody that said, just, via email is, okay, we get the online thing, but where do we start? What do we do? We want to do some, but how do I change to being better digitally? Do I promote my tasting room manager? What do I do?
Look, it's people, programs, and processes. It's the 3 Ps, and it's a cultural change. Again, it has to start at the top. And we have to invest in people. I mean, looking at Amy, and she had at the time Justin Nolan, who was a digital investment. I called it out last year at the DTC flywheel that you have me do every year. That'll come out tomorrow. Which is, she went outside the wine industry to bring in talent. That was a big deal. That was unusual, and Amy can speak more to that. But that's key to that. We have to bring in professionals. You wouldn't make the tasting room manager your winemaker unless you have winemaker skills, right? Or you wouldn't make your winemaker your CEO unless they had business skills. It's a promotion that has to do with the skill sets.
You wouldn't make your banker anything. I would just screw it up.
I'm going to jump in just for a sec here and point out as well. I think there have been some really great innovations in the last few years that have allowed us to, if you put in the right people and you do the right things and you have a good digital program, actually the ability to allow people to taste your wines and to do, say, virtual tastings, I think has really been supported by great innovations like Corvin, which it wasn't around 6, 7, 8 years ago. It didn't exist. So I think we're fortunate. There's a lot of gray clouds around this past year, but I think one of the silver linings is that we've recently had a lot of innovations that have allowed folks to actually take advantage of a real solid digital marketing programs and bring wine country to their door in a way that actually makes sense and is somewhat cost efficient. I mean, I think the Corvin mantra is a buck a bottle. It costs you to pour it if you're using their system. So
we also have systems like Commerce 7, that have invested huge time in this year. If you look at their innovations and the Bloom team bringing Shopify to the wine industry, those are innovations in their own mind to allow commoditization of e-commerce and digital in a way that's magical.
And I actually wanted to bring up a point about wine clubs and collecting of names in when people don't come through your tasting room. How do we do that? But before we do that, I really wanted to get Erik involved, because Erik, you've been quietly sitting at the bottom. Erik's an M&A professional, mostly handles stuff in the Pacific Northwest, occasionally in California. But Erik, what do you want to talk about? What's going on in the Pacific Northwest relative to all this? What do you think?
Well, I think relative to the topic that we're on right now is that we've seen a lot of people forced to shift their direct-to-consumer strategy. I think the Northwest had, certainly there were some folks that had more sophisticated direct-to-consumer programs than others, but generally had been lagging in best practices versus California. And we've been advising a lot of people in terms of not only better harvesting and management of their consumer data, but also in terms of creating, the elevated experience or the seated tasting, the appointment only tasting, and the Northwest has been a little bit more resistant to making those changes. Oregon, I think, has been more out in front on that than Washington, but both regions still really lagging California. And with the lockdown, everybody was kind of forced into that model. And those that had really good consumer data were the ones that were most successful at leveraging their existing consumer relations. And when people were forced into, seated tableside tasting only environments, appointment only environments, everybody was shocked at how effective it was. So, the mantra we kept hearing back from people is, our sales are flat, but our traffic is in half. So, if you were to reduce it down to kind of a thimble, it's, 50% the traffic, but double the average transaction. So the conversion rate is so much higher. And so we saw kind of mass experimentation and mass adoption of new DTC practices. And that's been a real validation of those practices. And I don't think that people are going to revert back to, slap $10 on the tasting bar and walk up to the bar and taste through 5 wines.
I really hope they don't, because the other really important part about that by appointment is you actually get names, addresses, phone, whatever you're going to ask for when you're setting up those appointments, you're going to get it now. And hopefully you are asking for phone numbers, cell phone numbers. But it's hard when you have the non-by appointment model or the walk-in model, and if people join your club, you obviously get their information, but we waste our overhead on people that come in and taste and leave. Now, just because they didn't buy in the tasting room doesn't mean that they didn't like your wine. It just means maybe they have enough. Maybe they were just up for a day and enjoying themselves and didn't plan on buying. You never know why they don't buy, why they don't join, but they do have an opinion now about your wine. And if you collect that data, you have a chance to retarget them in a real way. if you don't collect it, then you can't. And so the by appointment thing to me is a critical step. I know in talking to the folks in New York, you know, they with the lockdown that they went through, you know, they switched to the by appointment model, and in many cases had some of the best years revenue wise that they've ever had.
Rob,
Erik, go ahead, Amy.
sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's super important too to recognize, as you said, that while you get great consumer data if you do by appointment, it's also more efficient from an overall business perspective. And as Devin noted and Paul glommed onto, e-commerce and digital has unaccounted for costs that people aren't putting into the network. And people love to say, well, I want to do everything direct because I know I can get my highest margin. But the investment that needs to be made to set up the infrastructure does have some both upfront costs as well as ongoing costs, but they're well worth it if you know how to mine the data. And again, with this slide that's still up here, you know, we can see we don't even have people investing in those getting to understand the data. I know at many of the mid-size and large wineries, you've got entire teams that are great at mining Nielsen and IRI data and figuring out what your retailer on-premise group needs, but who's really looking at the final end consumer? And when you have that sit down by appointment only tasting opportunity, I think it does two things. One, it not only enables you to get their data, it enables you to run a more efficient staffing model on both the front end and the back end. And finally, it actually plays into the consumers, the growing consumers' desire for customization and personalization of interaction, right? And so you can really have a threefer if you continue with that model. It doesn't mean you can't have any days that you let a free flow in, but if you start to migrate your overall model to something that allows you to customize, to gain information, and to have a solid start to what can be a long-term relationship, whether that's on-site, online, or at their home, it really, I think, enables a much stronger and more sustainable future for the business.
It also allows you for better customer acquisition modeling, as you can look like audience or think about how you're targeting as a cohort versus imagining it. They're actually telling you who they are. I think the data has a lot of return on investment. And in fact, that's why Nike's went so strong into DTC. I mean, what are they, 40% DTC now, Amy? They're pretty, that's a big company, billion-dollar company.
It's an awesome point because you've got to get the depth of information in order to get your lookalike modeling perfected so that you can get higher and better acquisition at more efficient rates, as well as be more proficient with retention.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you guys brought up acquisition. I'm watching the comments come and questions come in, which there's no way we're going to get to all of these. It's amazing, all the questions. But you know, one from Christian that was kind of directed to you, Paul, which is about your statement about retention is the new acquisition. And I think what we've seen is a lot of wineries kind of got through 2020 through decent retention and better conversion on their existing customer base. But I think the real challenge coming into 2021 is how are we going to refill that bucket? How are we going to bring more new consumers in? Because we didn't get through 2020 through new consumers. We got through 2020 based upon the loyalty that our consumers had, and a lot of them increasing their direct spend with wineries that they really cared about and really wanted to make sure were kept around. But we were reliant on that flypaper, and we didn't have the flypaper effect in 2020. So how are we going to address that going forward?
But Erik, let's slow down for a second. I mean, to be really honest with you, we need a bit of mousetrap to retain those customers and extract the maximum value. We need a better retention modeling. Because we're very fortunate in enotourism that it fills up every weekend. Us honing that thing so that when we go spend money on new customer acquisition, we're getting the maximum value. I think we need to clean up the retention model first, because then we can go get new. And I agree, we have to get a better fly trapping and get stickiness, and that's going to come over time. But if we can really hone our skills into change the lifetime value of a customer from 18 months to 20 months, in the core, we've changed the dimension of our profitability of our winery by exponential numbers, right? And right now, our over dependency on customers within the same state or within a 90-mile radius is pretty significant. If you look at the math, we're over dependent on locality for enotourism more than we actually realize.
Yeah. And Paul, it hadn't occurred to me before, but as you said that, it's interesting that the issue of retention and incremental engagement to increase lifetime value is actually the same issue that has been talked about for decades in the tasting room. That often people love to go to tasting rooms and have a wonderful experience. But to your point, Rob, they aren't actually purchasing as much as we know they could because the sales associates don't sell. They actually love being hospitality leaders and sharing their story, but they often don't ask for the sale. So there's an entire industry built on, trainers that will come and secret shop your tasting room. And then ultimately they often are saying, well, your sales associate know your story, they love your wines, but they don't ask for the sale. Right. And I think that's the same, that's the analogy to what's happening in digital, Paul, that we need to know who they are and we need to be able to deepen that relationship so that we can increase lifetime value, which is getting comfortable with both the tools and the opportunities for asking for the sale on a more consistent basis with those that you already engage with.
So I'm going to do a time check. We're about halfway through, believe it or not.
Wow.
It always goes fast. So I'm going to pivot out. By the way, I hate the term pivot. It's been overused this last year. So I'm sorry for saying it. But let's move to something else. And Erik, I'm going to just start with you. I want to talk about what happened during the harvest this last year, and that back ends into smoke and everything else. But talk about what happened up in Oregon, Washington this last harvest.
Well, obviously, really different effects between Oregon and Washington. Oregon was significantly fire and smoke affected, and that was kind of that's not a new impact for Southern Oregon. Southern Oregon, that's kind of been baked into the cake for a while. But it was the impact of smoke and fires in the Willamette Valley was pretty dramatic, like we've never seen before. And so many of the effects that our friends in California experienced, our friends in the Willamette Valley experienced for the first time in any significant way. And that was on top of already what was a light crop to begin with. And so there was just a significant reduction in the amount of wine that was harvested. So one of the smallest harvests ever. And obviously some concerns about quality, particularly around red wine and Pinot Noir in particular. Wide-ranging opinions about the impact of smoke. So we want to be really careful to not paint everything with the same brush, because different winemakers have very different points of view about the level of impact that had on the wines in their particular cellars. And there's really localization to how much the impact was. So we don't want to paint the valley with the same brush, but it was significant. But Oregon was in mild oversupply going into the harvest, and we were anticipating with the light crop prior to the fires that it would come closer to balance. And now with the fires, it is just completely flipped. I mean, folks that in July and August were having a hard time contracting their fruit already have their fruit contracted for 2021 and often beyond. So it has accelerated us to the opposite end of the grape supply cycle in Oregon. So now fruit is significantly over demanded just based upon the short crop that was 2020.
Yeah,
Washington.
Let's bring up slide 18 if we can, Heidi, please. Go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, Washington, this is slide 18 is kind of interesting because slide 18 this is kind of self-reported data, right? And so, we just got the numbers started coming out within the last 24 hours in terms of what the real harvest numbers were within the state of Washington in particular. The numbers here for Oregon are not unsurprising in terms of the concerns about both quality, the next slide is about quality, but in terms of quantity, about it being extremely low, 52% saying it's the lowest ever or one of the lowest ever. Washington is only 8% saying that, but 54% saying weaker than average. But we just got the numbers in Washington. We had the smallest crop that we've had in the last 10 years. So part of that was just natural small crop set. Part of that was oversupply in the market and wineries not choosing to bring in as much fruit and fruit being left out in the field. There were some localized smoke effects. That's always an issue in Washington, but it's rarely a significant widespread issue, but there were some localized smoke effects on some vineyards, but not enough to really move the number in a meaningful way. But we had, I think we were at 175,000 tons this last year, where off of the record of about 3 years ago of 270,000 tons. So it's really a dramatic shift. and the supply there. The bad news is that, I mean, man, I can't imagine a worse year to be a grower in Oregon or Washington or California for that matter. But the system was already so dramatically oversupplied in Washington and California and mildly oversupplied in Oregon that these effects are going to bring us either back into balance or to maybe undersupplied in Oregon or more mildly oversupplied in Washington.
Yeah, and that is actually a good segue if I can find the slide that I'm looking for.
Shows consumption and yield, which kind of does a nice outline, Rob, of where we were in that gap, but then you can roll into kind of 22 and 23.
You go ahead, Amy, go ahead, shoot.
Yeah, that's a great slide. Those 22, 23.
That's what I was looking for, thank you.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, so this is, by the way, this is where we were coming into the year. So January 2020, and thank you, Ciati, by the way. Bulk wine, we were in acute excess, and this is one of the places where I always talk about the front of the report where I was right and wrong, and I expected we'd have several years of recovery that we needed to go with, and Jeff Bitter of Allied Grape Growers talked about pulling out 50,000, I believe it's 50,000 acres of producing vines just to meet supply, the demand component. So this is where we were. If we can go to the next slide, please, Heidi. And so this is what happened this year. This is month by month basis in California, and super interesting because as the large producers, especially the ones that were getting Central Valley fruit, figured out that they didn't have enough stuff in to actually ship out to the grocery stores, they started buying down the bulk that was available for their price points. They bought down all the stuff that was in pretty much Lodi and the Fresno, and they went to the Central Coast, and they started buying down the stuff that was in. That was probably one of the more impacted areas at that point, and buying at California prices. So the joke came back from the 1990s. Those were around. We had such a high demand at that point. We didn't have enough supply, and we used to say, well, we're going to age the bottles on the truck, and it's kind of what we ended up with. But so we ended up with kind of a balanced position, in the Central Valley, in particular, early on, probably by June-ish, and then sadly we ended up with a balance because of fire in the North Coast. We don't really have great data on what the final harvest numbers are going to be. I have to say I'm grateful that we were in acute oversupply, because if you have to be one of those wineries that decided not to produce a vintage, it's better to be oversupplied, right? Because you can't make up for what you don't have and you can't get, right? If you're an estate producer, you just can't send off to Asia to go make more. It just doesn't work that way, right? So it's a blessing in disguise that we're in balance. Now, all that said, I'm not convinced that we're in a place where we can say that we're in a stable point of balance. I think we still have too many acres, and with demand for still wine in particular effectively being zero, we really can't take a large harvest in this next year. If we do, we're going to be right back in oversupply, and it's going to impact prices. Prices have come up a little bit, talking to Turntine Ciati guys, but we're not where we were 5 years prior, where we saw increasing prices that were kind of getting a little bit toward the exorbitant side, and I just don't see that those are going to come back down until we work on the demand side. I think that's the next thing.
There's also been some work on the structural supply side. There are vineyards that are coming out, not really in Oregon, but California and Washington. And part of it is we were structurally in oversupply. It wasn't just market fluctuations. We were just planting at a faster rate than consumption was increasing. And so, we've been advising some institutional investors that have been looking at, really long-term trends on grape demand. because the estate model is one thing, right? You want to grow what you need for your business, but the institutional investors really need to be able to forecast longer. And prior, in the summer, we were telling everybody, well, man, absolute, absent some sort of, unforeseen catastrophe or major disruptive event, we're going to be where we're at for a long time. And then, of course, we had unforeseen catastrophe, and that accelerated it. But because we were at that state of such structural oversupply, there were a lot of growers, again, primarily California and Washington, not so much Oregon, who decided we're done. We're gonna swap over to other crops. We're gonna start pulling grapevines out, and that needed to happen. So that is, some cold comfort about our future potential balance of grape supply.
Future is the word that I think we should move to. And like I said, it's impossible to cover this whole report in an hour, which is why we have part 2 that will be presented next week. I encourage you guys to watch it. But let's pivot. I hate that word. Let's pivot anyway to the future. We got to talk about this consumer, and what are the changes that we've seen. Now there are some that are going to unwind. So let's look at, for instance, the off-premise. Are we going to have 67%? I think that was the Nielsen slide. It's 67% growth in March of 2021. Off of that, because that's what it was last year. We're going to have that kind of growth. No, there's no way. It'd be nice if we actually had reopening and the vaccines in place by March, where we'd see an improvement in business. I don't think we're going to get there yet, but we're still not going to have that kind of growth. And for off-premise to actually do what it did last year, it would be amazing if it could. And I just don't think that's going to happen. So that's a change that unwinds. And in the same token, once we get vaccine, we're all vaccine kind of limited, right? We're just gated by that item. We got to get to herd immunity. I don't know when the forecasts are. I know that in Napa County, I'm not scheduled to get an injection until May, I think, at this point. So everybody's got their own approach to it. Hopefully, it'll be before their Johnson & Johnson's got a vaccine that they're supposed to come out with, I think, in next month, which that might help, just adding more. But in any case, that's what we're gating by. When we do open, what's going to happen? Well, we'll unwind some of this. We'll unwind the stuff that went to grocery, and it'll go back through some of the other channels. When restaurants open, obviously, it's going to go back to restaurants. But restaurants are going to change, aren't they? And that's a reality. The National Restaurant Association came out yesterday, and they said that so far, not so far, but last year, there are 110,000 restaurants that are permanently closed, and a lot of those, if not the majority of them, are the white tablecloth independents that many of the viewers here like to sell their wine in. And recognize too, those restaurants, in some cases, they had to sell their cellars down just to generate cash to get through. And they still need some fiscal stimulus to get them through. By the way, we're not done with this, but looking through, what's a wine list likely to look like in that place? Well, they're not going to go and start by investing in a giant cellar. There'll be some, but that's not the way it's going to be. And those that have been out trying to go to restaurants in restricted environments, restricted restaurants, the fine dining, the wine lists have gotten dramatically smaller. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, let's not forget that those restaurants going out of business are going to be reselling that inventory into the market too. I mean, there's a constipation of that inventory that's going to continue. Would you agree with that?
And we're not going to be able to sell to a closed restaurant, right? So we're not going to see that kind of growth in restaurant sales. We have some slides on it, but we'll skip them for now, just for brevity's sake. And so that's one fact. What's happening with the consumer right now? What about some of the permanent changes for the consumer? Well, right now we have work from home. I'm working from home right now. Everybody in this call, I think, is probably working from home, in the panel. And, that's pretty unique. That sets up a lot of different things. Work from homes, that means shop from home. That's the growth in online has been explosive. There's a lot of charts in the report about that, some of which we've gone over. The other thing that the work from home is allowing is it's allowing people to go where they want. They don't have to, I'm in the Bay Area. They don't have to, for instance, work in San Francisco. If their headquarters in San Francisco, you don't have to go into that office. And now if you're like that, you say to yourself, well, if you're with a partner in your home and you're in a flat in an expensive city like that, you go, well, I need more space. We're both working from home and we both can work from home. And so you start going somewhere else. And so we are seeing that change in the consumer. The consumer's relocating. That also impacts, by the way, grocery stores. So again, just using the Bay Area as an example, if people used to commute and they don't have to commute anymore, then they're not going to be shopping for groceries in those grocery stores in big cities. If they're moving out of the big cities, that's fewer shoppers in those grocery stores as well. So that's another impact on the off-premise side, right? All that explosive growth we saw, the consumer may not be shopping in those that's the macro side, but the consumer may not be shopping in those same grocery stores that they had before. And then there's the online component of grocery shopping. I, for the first time, have bought groceries from Costco online. I wouldn't have done it except for the pandemic. And now I have an Instacart account. When the pandemic ends, am I going to close my Instacart account? No. Now this is permanently embedded into the way I think. So, we will see that kind of continuing growth. That's not necessarily positive. The Instacart component of it is probably not necessarily positive for wine sales. It's probably still yet to fully penetrate how we can buy wine or will buy wine. I don't think that's great. Nor, by the way, are the restaurant deliveries great for wine. Even though right now you can deliver in many places, I know in California anyways, you can deliver cocktails, example, pre-mixed and that kind of stuff. But inevitably, that's probably not the best way to get wine through a new channel. So this is part of the change that we're going to have to adopt to. Your consumer is in different areas. They're shopping in different ways. And online, I think actually, if you want to go to slide 42, Heidi, is probably a good slide. So this is from the survey. We talked to about 700 wineries that responded to the survey this year. And what are you going to invest in? What's the thing that's going to continue for you? And this is the answer. So the first channel is internet sales. That's what we've been talking about. That's the thing that most of the wineries recognize is the salvation. As Paul says, it's the opportunity for the golden age. Number two is Zoom. We haven't talked a lot about that, but boy, Zoom started off really weak when the shutdowns took place. It was just winemakers sitting in a barrel room saying hi. It was very difficult. And by the end, and this gets back to one of the things I wanted to talk about earlier, many people were doing Zooms and figuring out how to actually get new club members using Zoom. That's probably a best practice, right? If they're not going to come in the front door of your winery, you got to go find new ways to do it. And Commerce 7's data showed that last year, 27% of new club members came through digital means. So
hey, Rob,
we can do it. Yeah, please butt in.
Can we talk about Zoom as an overall arc? I know that everyone's Zoom is the buzzword of the day. I think this is a more macro trend that we should really look at, which is, and we've seen it before, the years before, is how do we talk to the customer in their home? And you've been pushing this agenda for a long time, but Zoom is just the tool that we're doing that with. But what we're trying to understand is how we can reach a customer outside of the taste room. And that's what
Yeah.
we should really categorize it as this. I know Zoom is the tool of the du jour, but there's lots of other tools to do this. There's lots of other ways to experience this. It's how do we get to them and engage with them when they're home is really the big shift.
And Paul, recognize that permanent change. One of the permanent changes is work from home means eat at home. And probably for the first time since the 60s and 70s, we're having family meals. Your children aren't going off to soccer practice or whatever. I mean, in a sheltering environment, that's where they are. And obviously that not all of that's gonna stick, but I believe a part of it will, especially since if you have two parents that are working at home now and not one of them commuting, far away as an example, and you can have dinners at 5 o'clock now or 6 o'clock, then I think those family meals, some of them are going to stick. And so that is the question, Paul, is how do we get to the family at the dinner table?
Absolutely.
Was that a harumph?
No, it's a harumph. I harumph. I'll give you we're aging ourselves right there with that one.
Yeah. Devin, you got some thoughts?
Well, that is the big question of the day, right? I mean, circling back to what we were talking about, 40 minutes ago about having people come to the tasting room by appointment. And now we're talking about how do we actually connect with people in their homes at the dinner table. It's really come full circle. I think we're all trying to figure that part out. One of the big things that I'm a proponent on is referrals, which you need now more than ever with tasting rooms closed. You've got to connect the dots. You've got to find the folks that already love your brand, that are already out there, hopefully in your database, if you've been doing a good job collecting customer info. You've got to connect those people, keep them connected with your brand, but also bring their friends into the party as well. And I think that's going to be the real tool for growth in the next quarter or two or three and beyond as we get through this hopefully last few months of the pandemic in its current state.
And when we talk about growth, the wine industry has been buoyed for 30 some years now on this compounding growth of increase in pricing and, premiumization, whatever we want to call it, as well as increase in consumption. And now that we're seeing kind of a leveling of consumption, we're also starting to see a leveling in terms of how much we can push price. I think going to slide 45 is a pretty interesting slide for us. Where we're seeing even pre-COVID, a change in attitude amongst wineries about how much we can push price starting in 2019. That was really affected by supply, of course. But to me, it's a pretty dramatic shift. If we look at the bar graph on the left to see where wineries were, pretty bullish in terms of price in their ability to increase price, and pretty mild feelings about folks that they felt like pricing had to be stable. Then all of a sudden in 2019 and 2020, we've got more than half of wineries feeling that they can't increase price. If you look at the pie graph over on the right-hand side and you combine the wineries that feel like they need to keep pricing stable, wineries that they can only manage a very small increase, or wineries that feel like they need to have a pretty small decrease, I mean, that's 89% of the wineries in the United States feeling that pricing really has to be stable right now. Which is a pretty impactful thing, given that, we're removing the two things that have compounded the growth of the industry for the last 30 years.
Yeah, and I am going to move away from that for just a second, because I actually think that this next year we're going to have some interesting price movements. The PR release that came out, the headline was that Silicon Valley Bank predicts that wine will see a spike in demand when consumers celebrate postponed life events. And so we have to recognize again, we got this unwinding thing that's going to happen. And I have the chart in my data, and I couldn't get it for today, but in 1945, you guys that know history, that was the end of World War II. And the spike in wine consumption, I did see the chart, I just didn't have the numbers to figure it out, but it was somewhere between 30 and 50%, just in that single year. People were celebrating, and And in this case, you know, there's a big guess about how much people are going to celebrate. I personally don't believe that I've seen any data that support that there's been a huge increase in consumption this past year. I don't see anything. I see some survey data, but the survey data, you know, it starts with how much did you drink last week? And there's too much range of error in that. But I think going forward, we have that history that is a piece of that projection. But think about what's happened this past year. How many people that you guys have known that had a wedding planned that got postponed? And they're all going to, I mean, call up wedding sites where people are, you know, going to have weddings, and you'll find their books solid. You know, talk to caterers that are still around. And you'll find that you know, all these deferred, delayed events, they're gonna come out this year, and on top of the people that were going to get married this period anyways. Now it's a rolling change, right? It's not going to be like World War II, where we had an end of things and a spike in celebration that was nationwide, or in some cases, you know, at least the Allied powers, it was, you know, across that world. This is a worldwide event, but the celebrations are going to be rolling. It's going to be very hard to figure out because it's vaccine based, really. But I think 2020 is going to be a good year, a year where our wine supply should be in better balance, where we're going to come back into a better state of growth, just for you know, a short period of time, but we'll take it. And I think it's going to be a better year. I think I can firmly say that. And you know, let's hang our hat on that. Let's look forward to the year ahead of us. With that, though, I think we're out of time. And let me see if I can find the yeah. Here's the closing information. If I can get to it, is over here. Sorry for being a little kludgy. So as a reminder, you can access the 2021 State of the Wine Industry Report on our website at svb.com/wine-report. I hope you all wrote that down, but you can go to svb.com. A replay of the videocast will be available and shared out to all attendees and registrants tomorrow, along with the registration for part 2 of the event. So we're going to talk for another hour after this, and we'll release it next week. And you guys we'll talk about some of the things that we haven't fully covered in this first hour, as well as many of the questions that have come up through this event. So that'll be shared out tomorrow with the registration for part 2. Please register. If you're interested, by the way, in participating in the State of the Industry surveys, or the DTC survey that's coming up in March, please submit your contact information in that email by filling out the survey. There's a survey, pardon me, at the end of this video cast, and you have an opportunity to please help us do the work that we do for the industry by joining that. So that's all I have for today. I'm grateful for all of your participation. Looking forward to seeing you hopefully next week on part 2 of the videocast for the 20th anniversary of the Silicon Valley Bank State of the U.S. Wine Industry Report. Thanks a lot, you guys. We'll see you soon.